Hello and welcome to our compilation of the top moments in Season 5 of Mythmakers. My name is Julia Golding, and Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. We've pulled out some moments which we think you might enjoy from I think we've reached almost 20 episodes in this season. Anyway, let's start with Romantasy. Now, Romantasy is the genre that everyone's been talking about, and there have been lots of books published in this area. And that name Romantasy is a blend of romantic and fantasy. And the book that really has been at the head of this trend is called Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. And in this excerpt, you'll hear me doing a sort of deep dive into what makes Romantasy work, the erotic content and how that has fed into the sort of popularity. And also I unpack the approach that Rebecca takes in her book. So I hope you enjoy. Let's look at the sociology of the popularity of this genre. I've mentioned it skews female. I've mentioned that it has high erotic content. And in this, it feels like a brand of adult fairy tale. And it sometimes feels like fan fiction. What I mean by that is someone has thought in their daydreams, here is a story. What would happen if I do an erotic daydream about it? Where can I push it? That's how it feels to me reading it. And there's nothing wrong with a healthy imagination for your sexuality. That's part of what makes us human, isn't it? So what works in the Rebecca Yarros book to make it so particularly popular? Well, just looking at it as a technical exercise, she's picked a first-person present tense narrative. Almost all of it is from the point of view of Violet, our main character. What this does is it gives an immediacy to the story, and it limits our knowledge of the world and its plot, so we discover it at the same time as she does to a certain extent, because Violet is going into this Dragon Rider program. So it's relatively new to her, though she has lived quite close to other family members who have gone through the same training. So she does have some knowledge. But that first person immediacy where she doesn't understand everything that's going on and the little plots and the conspiracies of that world. So we are following her in the way that you do in a detective fiction that's written from a first person point of view. And of course, that first person present makes us very close to the character. We are kind of her as we're reading it because of the I. But that immediacy wouldn't work unless the pacing was correct. It does have the first year at school structure, first year at university, which you find in other fantasy novels, of course. And sometimes the weakness in that let's do a whole school year thing is that you mark time to get to the next big event. And this doesn't happen in this book. So when she first joins the Dragon Rider program, we know that there's a big test coming up called Threshing. And that came earlier in the book than I was expecting. It isn't a climax at the end. It's more like a midpoint big event. So it means that it does actually, run along. It gallops along this story. And you don't get to the point where you think, oh, come on, let's skip a few pages. I want to see what happens. And so the actual structure of the book is that we resolve the question of will she or won't she become a dragon rider fairly early on, so that we have the rest of the book to unpack the politics of this world. And as you'll see from the actual physical book I'm holding up here, it's a long book. For those of you who are listening to this, let's do a quick look at the page count, 561. So it's not a short read, but it feels short because you're turning the pages. Twilight had that same box of chocolates feel that once you started reading it, you wanted to keep on eating the chocolates. So yeah, that works in this. I would just say, though, that even though the characters are supposed to be what I would call more university age, you don't really hear precisely of people's ages, but at one point, Xaden, the male hero, is mentioned as being 23.
they do feel younger to me. They do feel more like high schoolers. I don't know, maybe that's just me because I'm old and crumbly, but they kept saying they're adults and they're mature, but they didn't feel hugely mature to me. Anyway, that was just my my jaded, that's me being too old. I don't know. But I felt they felt younger than their given ages. Before I came to this book, I was looking for what was different about it, according to reviewers. And I saw two things which were sort of touted about it. One was the very high death count. So yes, lots of people die. You do lose a couple of beloved characters, but they're not central characters. They're adjacent characters. So are we shocked by high death counts? I mean, Harry Potter killed off quite a lot of people. That was a long time ago now. Game of Thrones killed off a lot of people. I don't know if that's that shocking. And obviously any book that has a war in it is going to kill people.
In our second excerpt, I introduce you to a podcast partner who I often have really fun conversations with. That's Jacob Renneker, who works for a games maker over in Seattle. And in this excerpt, he and I are discussing why fantasy films are so often overlooked at the Oscars. Last year's winner, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, is a kind of sci-fi high concept.
Right.
But yeah, I suppose you could say that's fantasy.
But border on fantasy, yeah.
So maybe when then they do have that element in them, it doesn't stop them winning. But with the only absolute mainstream total, yes, that's a fantasy film, is obviously Return of the King, which won the Oscar in 2004, I think it was. And yeah, everybody agrees that's a fantasy film. Whereas the others you might describe more as a hybrid of other sorts of genres. But let's flip over to the performances, and there you really do come up against a problem of them not rewarding performances in a fantasy film.
Right. Yeah. And that's to be expected. And with these, I think you're right on with the blending of genres makes it more palatable, that if it's a genre piece that's heavy fantasy or sci-fi, or even, to be fair, like you said, an action film, if it's kind of a big budget blockbuster action film, comedies, westerns even, westerns more so, because I think they can get to more of that serious / meaningful and tortured performances. But a lot of those kind of big budget mass audience films, those aren't the ones that are being considered here or rewarded. So for the actors, it's the same thing. So it's really interesting with the actors. In this most recent Oscar round coming up, that Barbie, which is a fantasy film, has nominations for Best Picture and 2 supporting actors and adapted screenplay, but not for Best Director or Best Actor. So Margot Robbie does not even get a nomination, even though the film is nominated, and the supporting actors. It's really fascinating looking at the supporting actors, right? Ryan Gosling and America Ferrera, as kind of more tortured. Yes, it is Barbie's story, but if you look at what the characters themselves are having to wrestle with more intensively, and what they're in that degree of supporting actor, not in the primary actor. It's really interesting on how Margot Robbie and the main character for the film would not be nominated, but it's the same film and the same storyline, but the 2 supporting actors for that from that fantasy film are nominated. So there's a really interesting, I think that's a good demonstration of what is, because Margot Robbie's character is Barbie most of the way through, right? It's kind of her performance is fairly even and level, whereas the other 2 are characters that are kind of yanked from their world, and you see them wrestling, at least in how it is more intensively, because I think perhaps less screen time on them, you can see the wrestle a little bit more. It's kind of more intense than over the entire film, but
they have a better song.
Yeah, Right. Exactly. The song doesn't hurt, but yeah. So the individuals and performances. Yeah. So we have, like, with Lord of the Rings in particular, with as many Academy Awards as it did receive, including, Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay for Return of the King. The only actor nomination or award that you got was for Ian McKellen, just from Fellowship of the Ring. Was the one that was won there. So it's interesting looking at the different characters there, and there's it's hard to say, but that's just an interesting trend.
So did Ian McKellen? Did he win something for it, or was he just nominated? I thought he was. I didn't think any of them got an acting award.
He didn't get an award, but it was a nomination. So he was the only one that was nominated. Didn't win, but that was even the only nomination across all three films, was just Ian McKellen for Fellowship of the Ring.
Oh, I'd forgotten that. I'm just looking through the list of people, of men who won the acting role. I need to pull up the women, because I'm having in the back of my mind that maybe Michelle Yeoh won one for Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So that's a woman winning a main, if we allow that to be a fantasy. Of course, Joaquin Phoenix won for being
Joaquin
Joker.
Phoenix,
and that's exactly what you
Heath
say.
Ledger.
It's the
tortured.
It's got to be tortured. Right. Torture your character.
Right. And I'd say, like, even for like the big budget, big budget Joker versus Dark Knight. So you have I would say, like, the two best actor roles in a fantasy type or a fantasy adjacent film. You have Heath Ledger for the Joker and Joaquin Phoenix for the Joker, both of which performances are these, again, like tortured individuals that are vacillating between two different worlds. And so, but it's really interesting that it's the same character that is winning both of those roles, even though it's different franchises. It's within the same story world of Batman. That's where you get these. But Batman is never nominated for, or does never get this award for. I don't even think nominated for Best Actor. Whereas the villain, the more kind of emotionally complicated and tortured. I hate to keep going back to that word, but yeah. So that's kind of a anomaly in the Best Actor wins.
Moving on to our third excerpt, I began the year by having an absolutely amazing time in New Zealand in January. So I came back ready to spread the news about how excellent it is for Lord of the Rings fans to visit the place where many of the films were made. And you'll hear me and Jacob discussing where it's best to go in New Zealand for your Lord of the Rings pilgrimage. If you were going to go to New Zealand, have you got any sort of on your must-see list of things to go to?
That's hard.
Speaking of.
Yeah, having watched it. Yeah, so I know that with one of the reasons why New Zealand made for such a great filming location is the incredible diversity of the landscape, right? So you can, within an hour and a half flight, you can get to, snowy mountains and, forests, kind of rolling hillsides, sparse terrain. The only thing they don't have is a desert. So that any of those places, like, I would be tickled. I mean, Hobbiton is picturesque. And so that of course would be fun for more of a, if on that particular travel day, I was looking to relax a little bit more, slow my pace, I think that would be great. If I was in a frenetic mood, I would perhaps want to be a little more adventurous and go hiking the path of Karadrath. And
that is quite that hike. Yeah. No, I mean, the funny thing is that even though I sort of think I'm fairly, I did geography at school and I sort of knew a map vaguely of New Zealand, and I'd watched the making of, I hadn't really grasped until I went there exactly how it all works. So if you're planning your trip,
tell us.
If you're planning your pilgrimage, the two islands, the South Island is sort of a rounder and fatter island. It's further south, so it's colder. And that's where the dramatic Alp
type scenery is. Not that the North Island doesn't have mountains, but it's the ones you're thinking of in the fly past. But it's also very, very sparsely populated. So it's real wilderness. You can go to places where there are no farms, there's no fences, there's no sign of people for miles and miles and miles and miles. It's quite a phenomenon. So if the population is something like, don't quote me on this, but it's something like 5 million, only 1 million of those live in the South Island. The North Island, which is kind of longer and thinner, a bit like a diamond shape, very roughly, with Wellington down the bottom and Auckland up the top, has everybody else. And a lot of those people are in either Auckland, which is the biggest city, and Wellington. So it reminded me a bit actually of Iceland. Iceland has a similar thing, except east to west, where lots of people live around Reykjavik and the rest of the country is fairly empty. So it had that feel to it. And no wonder both places are used for fantasy films, because they have so many places you can set up a camera and do a 360 pan without seeing anything else. So if you're actually planning to do your Lord of the Rings tour, we did it an unconventional way. Most people start up in Auckland and make their way down to Queenstown. I actually did it the other way around. Why not? So I would say my top 5 places to go would be, in order of visiting them, I would go to the lakes around Lake Tekapo, which is quite near Christchurch. So you're on the South Island. And Lake Tekapo and the lake next door to it, whose name escapes me just now, are the lake. There you see them in the Hobbit for Lake Town. Is that sort of amazing, really, really blue, wonderful lake, very beautiful. Also a great place to stargaze. Then going down, I'd go to Queenstown, which is like number 1. Queenstown is almost everything. It's almost everything. It's the Remarkable Mountains. There's a range called the Remarkables, are used again and again. They're the barrier mountains from Mordor. They pop up loads of times. They're used for part of the retreat where they go up into the hills in Rohan and they get the sword. I'm just trying to remember what that place is, near the Paths of the Dead. And then, of course, up at near Queenstown, if you go along the lake to a place called Glenorchy, this is a couple of hours drive, right up towards the foot of the mountains. There you see Caradhras. There you see Zirac Zigil, where Gandalf fought the Balrog. There you see Beorn's house. I mean, it was multi-purpose. Bits of Lothlorien. It's absolutely beautiful. I've got it as my desktop saver because it's such a beautiful place. It's so I highly recommend Queenstown. And now in excerpt 4, we change the mood a little. I've been working on a series which I'm continuing to do a chapter by chapter deep dive from an author's point of view into my favourite book, The Lord of the Rings. And I'm hoping that by looking at it from the perspective of someone who also writes many novels and fantasy novels included, that you'll be getting some fresh insights that will accompany you on your next reread of The Lord of the Rings. And here I am discussing chapter 3 of The Fellowship of the Ring, where the hobbits are just about to set out on their journey. Now, the main thing I want to talk about in the writer's journey in this particular chapter is some wonderful evocations of place, but absolutely charged with emotion. And here we get a very good example. Just as they're about to leave, the sun went down. Bag End seemed sad and gloomy and dishevelled. Frodo wandered round the familiar rooms and saw the light of the sunset fade on the walls and the shadows creep out of the corners. So that's a sort of darkening of the mood. But that word dishevelled, that's a very Tolkien word. It comes up again in relation to a description of a woodland being or a forest being dishevelled. It's normally used of a person. Someone is,
like you go through a hedge, you come out dishevelled. So therefore it means that Bag End is given a sort of personality. It's dishevelled, it's neglected, it's empty. It's a very good choice of word. And without any fanfare, we get introduction to one of the most scary of our bad guys, which is the introduction of a Black Rider. It's muted, though, because Frodo is overhearing a conversation where he can really only hear Gaffer Gamgee's part of that. And Gaffer Gamgee is not cowed by the Black Rider. Black Riders themselves, they gain in power as this book goes on. They gain in power as their numbers increase. But at this point, Tolkien is still playing his cards close to his chest. On a second reading, you know what's going on, but the first time you read this, you're unaware just how important this conversation is and how much in danger Gaffer Gamgee is and Frodo himself. But it reminds us that Frodo is hunted and people are looking for him. So thankfully, finally, he actually gets going. Still, there's no particular hurry. They're walking at night through landscape that they've walked many times before, that they know like the back of their hands. And what I want to highlight here, which is a huge strength of Tolkien's writing, which is that everything is very specific. You feel as though you could actually pick up this book, and if this place existed, you could use it as a guide to how to go on this walk. But his descriptions are always loaded with a certain kind of mood and atmosphere. And in this first one, as they leave Bag End, there's this subtle poetry of thinness. It starts with Frodo joking that if he carries on walking, he'll burn off some of his fat and he'll end up like a willow wand. But that idea of thinness then seems to be folded into the landscape. It's full of spindly images. You've got the black ribbon of the stream, the smoke-like wisps of mist, the thin-clad birches. These are all in the next paragraph or two. It's a reminder that Tolkien is also a poet. His use of the language when it comes to the landscape is particularly subtle, powerful, and really well imagined. This isn't a vague fantasy world somewhere other. This is a landscape that he makes you believe in 100%. And as they settle down for the night in the roots of a big pine tree, making a fire of the pine cones and dry wood, you almost feel as though you're getting a guide to camping in the English countryside. Tolkien and his friends loved their walking holidays, so they probably actually themselves did something very much like this. And then there's an odd note. A fox enters the story and is given a moment when we hear the thoughts of this fox, thinking how strange it is to see the hobbits abroad at night. Now, this is possibly one of the last echoes of a book meant for children, the idea of an animal with sort of human-like thoughts. But it also is in step with the idea of the Shire being friendly. It's foxes they have in the Shire, not the wolves and the wargs that they will later meet. I can't think of another occasion when the narrator actually goes into the head of an animal. Obviously, there are speaking animals like the eagles, but this little passage is an oddity. And carrying on with this theme of the brilliance of the nature writing you get in Tolkien, and why I would personally choose it as my desert island book, because I feel transported back to some of the most beautiful parts of the English countryside when I'm reading this. And finally, there's been quite a lot of Tolkien-related news for those who are fans of films in this season. There's both an animated film forthcoming about the Rohan culture, the War of the Rohirrim. But the one that caught our attention is the news that Peter Jackson and Andy Serkis have teamed up to begin work on a prequel called The Hunt for Gollum. So if you want to find out what The Hunt for Gollum might be like, have a listen to our discussion. So there is a long period where Gandalf and Aragorn are hunting him. In fact, Gandalf says he goes away and it's Aragorn who actually catches up with Gollum and calls him back. There's that
part, so you just need to turn to the chapter called The Shadow of the Past and you can read that material. There's what happens after that, after they've talked to Gollum, is he is put in the care of the Wood Elves. That's Thranduil, Legolas's father, that kingdom, and he's looked after there. And we get another little glimpse of what might have happened to Gollum when Legolas reveals that Gollum escaped the elves' care captivity. And this is something that comes up during the Council of Elrond. So there's another mention of Gollum at that point. Thinking about this as a literary technique, it's Tolkien keeping on just gently nudging us of Gollum's existence so that when he does turn up, we've had the way prepared for us with talk of Gollum. So 2 places to have a quick look at would be The Shadow of the Past and the Council of Elrond to see the material which the hunt for Gollum might be covering. But there's also a third place which you may not have noticed because it's in the appendices. This is where they're really working their rights as Peter Jackson and Andy Serkis, because it comes in Appendix B, where there is a timeline of the Third Age and the key events. And the hunt for Gollum features in that. So, for example, we hear that at Bilbo's farewell feast, Gandalf begins to suspect that the ring is the one, and he sets off seeking for news of Gollum and calls on the help of Aragorn. So that's 3001. And then it's not till 3009. It's quite a long film, this, isn't it? I imagine they'll truncate all of this. It says Gandalf and Aragorn renew their hunt for Gollum at intervals during the next 8 years. They're persistent, got to give them that. Searching in the vales of Anduin, Mirkwood and Rhovanion to the confines of Mordor. At some time during these years, Gollum himself ventured into Mordor and was captured by Sauron. That sort of is that central bit where the key fact that Baggins from the Shire got the ring is revealed. Gollum is actually in captivity in Mordor for some years because it says in 3017, so that's 16 years after Bilbo's farewell feast, Gollum is released from Mordor and is taken by Aragorn in the Dead Marshes and brought to Thranduil in Mirkwood. So that's the bit that links up to the captivity on the Wood Elves. And you'll remember when Gollum is travelling with Frodo and Sam, he talks about not liking elven food. And also we learn another detail that the reason why he escaped the Wood Elves, I think this is during the Council of Elrond, that they took pity on him and would allow him to climb a tree to sort of sniff the air. And a gang of orcs came by and killed his guard and he escaped. And that was possibly set up as a way of helping him escape.
Thank you very much for listening to Mythmakers this season. We start again very soon in September, and we will begin with some fantastic debut authors who have already crossed my path, and I look forward to sharing their work with you. But as ever, we will also be doing a lot of Tolkien-related content and carrying on with our travels through the Lord of the Rings, the writer's journey. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.